Creating a dungeon for any tabletop RPG is a multi-step process. In the last video, we looked at how we can take all the nebulous ideas of our dungeon and make it more concrete, turning it into an actual dungeon map, and also fleshing out all the ideas for the backstory of the dungeon, what we want in it, kind of creatures, and the sort of experience the players will have in the dungeon. In this video, we finalize all of that in the, what you could call, the rendering process. We basically take all the information we created in the last video and turn it into the dungeon document, which is sort of like the document that contains the maps, of course, but also the area descriptions that has all the information for how to run the dungeon, and the precursory information that kind of sets everything up and helps the DM. You don't need to watch the last video to follow this one, but it probably helps because I'm going to use examples from the previous video. We'll start by looking at the writing part. We'll be looking at how to balance the combat encounters in the dungeon. Then we'll look at how we can actually draw a pretty map and not just have the black and white map, how to playtest and all that good stuff. But let's start with the writing. This text is the first part of the dungeon document, and its purpose is to prepare the DM with general information about the dungeon that isn't specific to certain areas, as well as provide a guide on how to get the dungeon going. Generally, the intro text should have the following sections: backstory of the dungeon, current situation in the dungeon, general descriptions like room heights, light conditions and so on, adventure hooks, and the starting the adventure text. The backstory is there to help the DM improvise details and information in case players investigate things that are not clearly explained in the area descriptions. It gives the DM a general sense of what the place is like and what you might find if you look around more carefully, and it sets the stage for the whole dungeon. We wrote the backstory for our dungeon in the last video, but the general idea of the backstory is that we want to tell all the important events that happened since the dungeon was first built, up until the moment the player characters arrive at the dungeon. The current situation text follows the backstory, and here you briefly detail what the dungeon is like at the moment. Our sample dungeon that we started to make in the previous video is this old hermitage out in the desert, where a group of hermits and artificers have sort of settled down out in the wastes to have this very isolated lifestyle, where they just create these trinkets and magical artifacts that they can then sell for food and such, and basically live a peaceful and quiet existence out there. For the current situation text for this dungeon, it could look something like this. Today, the old hermitage in the cliffs is dusty and abandoned. Dry desert winds moan through the corridors, still strewn with the bodies of long dead invaders and defenders. And only in the darkest corners does things still move. Though ransacked long ago, this place still has secrets to uncover. After these stage setting text, you can put the general information. Sometimes players need to know the height of rooms and what the light conditions are like, and some might be prone to knocking down doors and stuff like that. And instead of detailing this in every area description, we just put it here for the general conditions of the dungeon. For our dungeon, we can state that, unless otherwise specified, rooms and corridors are 10 feet high. During daytime, all areas are dimly lit by small passages of sunlight in the cliffs, and at nighttime, all areas are dark. Doors are made entirely of old dried wood and require a DC 11 strength athletics check to break them down. Their dried up nature allows characters to glean through the cracks in the wood. Also, if you have a lot of similar traps, you can also add information about them in this section instead of repeating it in all the area descriptions. Next, we add the adventure hooks. This is one of the steps that you probably don't need if you're just making the dungeon for your own private game, since you probably already know how it fits into the campaign. The adventure hooks are basically a list of suggestions for how the DM running the dungeon can entice the players to actually go into the dungeon. Of course, you can just take the players, put them in front of the dungeon, ask them to go in and enjoy themselves. But the adventure hooks is sort of the first opportunity for the players to interact with the dungeon. It can form the basis of a prologue to the dungeon run. Perhaps if you're doing it as a one-shot, it's maybe a good opening where the players can learn each other, and it basically primes the players for the things to come. So here are some hooks for our sample dungeon. The first one: a guild of artificers are trying to rebuild a magical construction that once helped irrigate the valley they live in, but they lack crucial knowledge on the old design. According to local history, one of the original creators left with a band of hermits to live in seclusion out in the desert, taking her knowledge with her. The artificers are willing to pay adventurers who will go out and find the old hermitage and bring back knowledge about the irrigation construct. The second hook. A local village is struck by a tragic kidnapping of one of the village children by a giant eagle. The parents are willing to pay adventurers who will dare the deserts and search for their child where the giant eagles roost. It is said to be an old hermitage in tall cliffs far out in the desert. Time is of the essence. And the third hook. A shady looking person is offering gold to adventurers, willing to take him out to an old hermitage in the desert in order to find and resurrect the body of one of his ancestors. The ancestor was part of the invaders who sought the Orb of Knowledge, and if they are resurrected, they might urge the adventurers to search for the thing that they failed to find. Details on the locations and NPCs in these hooks is left to the DM, unless you want to expand the scope of the dungeon to include a nearby town and NPCs. The last part of the introduction text is the starting the adventure section. This is just a short description that sets the stage for the dungeon itself and puts the players into a position where they can begin approaching it. For our sample dungeon, the text could be something like this. Your trek through the desert comes to an end as you finally spot the tall cliffs topped by greenery. As you get closer, you hear the screeches of birds, and the outline of a staircase carved into the cliff draws your attention towards the narrow doorway near the top. Dry and desperate foliage cling to the foot of the cliff here and there, with one patch having grown to an outstanding height. As the sun bakes you from its high perch in the sky, you arrive at your destination. And that is it for the dungeon introduction. We now have what we need to get the dungeon going, so let's look at the other part of the writing, the area descriptions. You could argue that the area descriptions are the dungeon, and they can be divided into two parts, the descriptive text and the functional text. The descriptive text is the thing that you read or paraphrase to the players when they enter a new area, and the functional text tells you what can happen in the area and how it works. Starting with the descriptive text, there are a few things that this bit of writing needs to accomplish. It must set the stage for the new area, it must set the mood, and it must highlight important aspects of the area. It also shouldn't be too long, since the players might lose track of the description if it drags on, so you have to be efficient with your writing as well. This means looking for the most descriptive words to convey as much meaning as possible, as well as trying to find the most precise way to describe something. Leave out mundane details such as doors and lighting fixtures, unless there's something special about them. A good way to start the descriptive text is going for the senses. Is the lighting unexpected compared to other areas? Does it smell differently? Are there sounds that are out of the ordinary in this place? Next, describe the room in general. Like, what kind of furniture is here? What's the decor like? Again, be brief and don't try to describe every piece of furniture individually. And last, end the description with highlighting important things. For example, if the area has a big window with a great view, this is where you put that. Or, if there's a puzzle, describe the pieces that the character can see at a glance. Maybe there's a ship in a bottle on a mantelpiece, which is part of some quest or is just very valuable. So, put it in this part of the description. The last part of the description is the easiest to record for the players, so if you want them to notice something, this is where you put it. You can say words by abridging the description by using broad words like kitchen or prison cell early in the description. These words imply a lot about the room, so you don't have to state that there are stoves, work tables, spice racks and such. Now let's move to the functional text. If we leave this blank, all the players can do in an area is enter and then leave. So this text is what actually brings life to the dungeon. The first thing that you can put in this text is the encounter descriptions. This is a section of text that tells what kind of opponents can be encountered in this area and how the encounter will be triggered. Depending on the type of opponent, this section might have some information about how they behave, like maybe they retreat towards another area if they drop to half hit points, or maybe they attempt to surrender. It can contain information about how the encounter develops, like after a certain amount of rounds, more opponents show up from some other area, or something else happens. It's a good idea to make sure that there's a variety in the ways that encounters are triggered, so it's not all about entering a room and starting a fight. Immediately. Always. The next thing you can put in the functional text is puzzle descriptions. If an area has a puzzle, this is where you describe how it works, how its intended solution looks like, and some possible ways to bypass it. For example, maybe the players can't figure out the puzzle By casting the knock spell will still open the door or chest or whatever it is they're trying to enter. You can also decide that the knock spell will not work here, and then describe why, so that the DM has some kind of answer if the players ask about it. If there are locked doors in an area, tell if they can be lockpicked or so, and how hard it is. Also mention where the key can be found, even if it is in a different area. If there are secret doors, how hard are they to spot? And are there any clues in the room that the characters might find if they're searching for it? Any treasure found in the area should be described in its own little section to keep it sort of collected and easy to look up, even if it is behind a puzzle or a secret compartment. And basically, write anything else that might affect the characters in a meaningful way, like NPCs, traps, magical pools that heal or turn weapons magical, or anything basically. Good formatting of the functional text is also important, because when you're running the dungeon, you don't want to have to read through an entire area description because you need to know what the DC for picking a lock is. I found that putting information under short titles helps immensely when you're looking for information. For example, I start the treasure section with the word treasure in bold, then comes the text that describes the actual treasure. Similar for locked and secret doors. Start the section with locked door in bold, and then write about it. This might seem like an obvious suggestion, but even official modules don't do this often enough, and it really helps when you're looking for information on the fly while the player's asking questions and everything is going on at the same time. Also, concerning formatting, be mindful of the length of an area's text. The more information you put into the functional text, the more difficult it is for the DM to remember it, so if the text gets a bit too long, see if you can move some of it to other areas where there's not as much going on. Basically makes it easier to read on the fly. Like when I'm writing dungeons, I really like that I'm able to quickly scan the text for the area that the player's about to enter while they're deciding who goes in first. Alright, I'm now going to show a couple of examples of area descriptions from the dungeon to show how all of this works in action. Area 1. The Shoe Room. This area is the main entrance to the Hermitage. Description: the narrow steps on the cliff face ascends until you reach a small landing in front of an open stone door. Behind it is a small room with sand piling against the walls and a low moaning sound coming from a passage to the south. The stone walls are carved with shelves upon shelves, mostly filled with tattered boots and desert shoes. A door leading north hangs wide open on sagging hinges, revealing a cut passage with many holes to the surface, letting in spots of bright sunlight. A couple mummified corpses lie strewn on the floor. Shoe shelves. The shelves in the wall contain 3 dozen or so leather boots and shoes of all sizes. They are all stiff with age and filled with grit, but might be restored with appropriate methods. The footwear belonged to the hermits, and this is where they would change from their home shoes before setting out into the desert. Names can be found in some of them, including the name Mithridatea. Corpses. The 2 corpses inside the door were hermits surprised by the sudden attack. They wear no armor, but appear to be dressed for a trek in the desert. Both have large, dark stains on their sandy robes from the wounds. A character investigating the bodies and succeeding on DC 13 Wisdom Medicine check can tell that the hermits were slashed on their arms before being stabbed in the stomach. Locked door. The door leading to Area 6 is locked. The key can be found in the workshop in Area 7, or the lock can be picked with a successful DC 14 Dexterity check using Thieves' Tools. The old door takes a successful DC 18 Strength Athletics check to break down. Treasure. A character looking through the shoes on the shelves finds a small leather pouch containing 8 silver pieces and a note saying, "If they have any dates, please bring as many as you can carry." E. One of the corpses has a rusty dagger hidden in the boot. The pommel is set with a large pearl worth 100 gold pieces. A second sample area description. Area 31. The Meeting Pool. This area is a place where the hermits gathered and held meetings. Description: a huge cylindrical chamber opens up before you, going all the way up to the top of the cliff, where it opens up to the sky above. Vines grow over the edge far above and reach all the way down through the humid air to the circular pool filling most of the room, apart from a narrow passage along the walls. A large bush full of vibrant flowers sit in the shade along the northern wall, its roots dipping into the water. and in the center of the pool is a single stone large enough for a person to stand on. Functional text: the water in the pool is an average of 30 feet deep. Anyone diving can find the remains of the battle that took place here, rusty armor and weapons, as well as a few valuables. Ghosts: if a character stands alone on the central stone in the pool, they might catch a glimpse of faces reflected close to the water's edge. The last character leaving this area for the first time hears a faint echo of voices. Encounter: the flowery bush in the northern part of the room is part of a man trap. See Appendix B. If a character gets close to investigate or tries to leave or enter the room through the northern passage, the man trap sends out pollen, trying to lure the character for an attack. Treasure: on the bottom of the pool are 4 pieces of silver jewelry worn by the hermit defenders when they fell, each worth 25 gold pieces. And those are 2 examples of area descriptions. Before we leave the writing part, I want to add a few words about labeling areas. Usually areas are labeled with a number, which might have a letter attached if an area is sort of split into more sections that doesn't warrant entire area descriptions on their own. Here you can see the dungeon map where I have added area labels. When you number the areas, you should do so with the following in mind. Try to keep areas relevant to each other close in the numbering. If areas are neighbors, they should have similar numbers, but this isn't always possible since we have loops in our dungeon. Therefore, try to number the areas in the most likely sequence of discovery. Again, since we have loops and done our best to make this dungeon non-linear, this isn't always possible, but we can do our best. For example, I chose to number the areas of level 3 right after those of level 1, because the dungeon is designed to make it more likely that the players will go to level 3 before they go to level 2. Also try to number the dungeon areas so that the final room is the last area, since this brings it closer to any epilogue text that you might add at the end. I also drew this map which shows the sphere of influence for each area. You don't have to do this, but if you have the time, do it, because it'll help you make sure that you have no gaps in your area descriptions. It'll also force you to think about which corridors should belong to which area description. Like, when I look at this map, I'm reminded that area 3 must have a bit of text describing the corridor that leads north, or that area 1 must describe the locked door to area 6. Once done with the writing, we can move on to the next step: balancing combat encounters. Now that we have the dungeon map from the previous video, and the description for the areas from this one, the dungeon is basically ready to play. Before we unleash it on a group of players, however, or unleash a group of players on it, we should do a bit of testing. While we can't test the dungeon's pacing and ease of understanding without fresh eyes of players, we can check whether the combat encounters are balanced. This involves playing a good deal of D&D encounters with yourself, so let me show you how you can go about this. First, arrange all the encounters of the dungeon roughly in the order that you think the players are going to encounter them. If we expect characters to level up during the dungeon, mark this in the encounter order where you think it's most likely to happen. Then determine if there are any sort of combat relevant loot in the dungeon that the players might find, and mark it in the encounter order where you think they are most likely to find it. Loot like this can be healing potions, magical weapons, and so on. After that, prepare a balanced party of 4 characters of the level you designed the dungeon for. You can make the characters yourself, of course, or use pre-made characters. If you are making a dungeon for D&D, you can grab pre-made characters from level 1 to 10 on D&D Beyond. It's a bit difficult finding the proper 1 to 10 pre-mades in there these days, but I'll put a link to them in the description. Now that you have a party, run the encounters from beginning to end. This might sound a little bit boring, just playing D&D combat by yourself, but I actually find it kind of fun. It's basically like you are being a player in a campaign, but every turn is your turn. Make sure to use the items that the characters would have access to in a given encounter, and allow for maybe 2 short rests during the entire encounter sequence. Try to take note of the party's average damage output and the average damage output of their opponents. These numbers will give you an idea of how long an encounter will be based on how many hit points the opponents have and how many rounds the party can be expected to last, given the damage that they receive. Of course, this kind of combat won't take into account the player creativity, the use of the environment, or some wacky ideas that negate encounters altogether, but it still gives you a good idea of how difficult the dungeon is. If you can't get to the end of the encounter sequence with the party that you made, you might need to scale the opponents down a little bit. On the other hand, you might not want to have an encounter sequence that doesn't even threaten to knock down a character or 2. run the encounter sequence maybe 2 or 3 times at least, so the log of the dice sort of averages out and you get a better understanding of the encounters that you made. Maybe you feel one of the encounters is really boring, so adding a new feature to the opponent might be an option. Or another encounter is done within the first round, so you might want to boost the hit points of the opponents or the number of opponents. The important thing is to look at all the encounters together, because while one encounter might be too easy, making it more difficult might sap the party of resources that they need further down the line, meaning you'll have to make another encounter slightly easier, maybe by downgrading the damage dice or removing multi-attack or something like that. If your dungeon is intended for just your own game only, then you can stop here. You now have a dungeon that is playable and pretty much as balanced as it's gonna get. There are still 2 more steps you can take, but these are more important if you plan to publish a dungeon to a wider audience. The first is drawing the pretty map, and the second one is playtesting. Let's start with drawing a pretty map. There are 2 options for drawing dungeon maps, either by hand on paper or digitally. Or I suppose oil on canvas if you're crazy, but maybe you're not crazy. I only have experience with drawing digital maps, so I'll show you that process. This subject could probably be a video on its own, and maybe I'll make that further down the line, but for now let's look at the basics. First off, you need software that has the following features. It must allow you to draw in layers. It must have customizable brushes, and it must have grid guide lines. A lot of software fulfills these requirements, and I once used Photoshop, but I've switched to Affinity Photo 2 because it's a one-time purchase and not a subscription-based one. But there are excellent free alternatives. The best I can think of is Medibang, which I will link to in the description. The first thing I'd recommend you do when you're drawing a dungeon map is to make texture tiles. Here are some of the examples of those I made for this sample dungeon. Tiles like these allow you to cover areas with detailed floor patterns very easily, so you can focus on the more fun details. If you have like dirt or grass, you might draw it by hand, but if you're having a stone floor or like a tiled roof, you probably don't want to draw every single stone and tile, so this really helps the process. When you make tiles like these, you need to ensure a few things. First, the ratio of the tile must be 1:1. The tile must be repeatable without obvious seams. The size of the tiles must be appropriate to the size of your map, pixel-wise, because if your tile is too large, you'll have to scale it down way too much and you'll lose a lot of the details that you've drawn. The hardest part of making tiles is making them repeatable, but there's a method to do this. Start by sketching the tile to get a sense of the overall structure. Then do what we call an offset to check how the tile repeats. An offset here refers to the act of taking the outside boundaries of your tile and lining them up so you can see if they create visible seams. You can do this manually by splitting the tile in half horizontally and then flipping the 2 halves, followed by the same procedure in the vertical plane. You will now be able to see the seams and do some correction to hide them if necessary. This can be done automatically in a different way depending on the software. For example, in Affinity Photo 2, you can use the Distort Equation filter to move and wrap the tile like this. Very easy, so if your software has some sort of equivalent function, I highly recommend that. Once you have fixed the seams of the sketch, you can draw the tile in proper detail. How you do this is up to your choice of your style, but keep in mind that it needs to be more contrasty than you might think, because you're going to scale this down, so contrast becomes important. When you are done, do the offset again and tidy up the seams. And this is it. A repeatable tile. I'll just show here in very quick time lapse the process of making a mossy stone tile. Now that you have the tiles, how you use them depends on the software. You can either do this manually by copy-pasting the tile over and over again in the same layer, or use a more automatic function. For example, in Affinity Photo 2, I made a pattern layer from the tile, and then I drew a mask that only showed the pattern layer where I drew. It's always pretty satisfying to just paint the textures on the map like this. But again, different software has different methods of doing this, so try to find out what works best. When you have covered the map with floor textures, we can move on to the details. Props is a huge thing in making a map come alive, and while you might not have a ton of experience in drawing chairs from a top-down view, thankfully They don't have to be super pretty, since we're going to scale them down quite a bit, and no one's going to see all the little ugly details that you make. A good idea is to start with repeatable props, so you can begin to fill out the dungeon. For example, in the sample dungeon that I made, I could reuse crates and barrels quite often, sometimes changing the color a little bit or rotating them to make it look less obvious that they're just copy-pasted. And again, the map is going to be quite small on a page, so even repeating props is not gonna show up that easily. Black lines to indicate texture is often used in official D&D maps, like indications of the direction of a river, or dirt on the floor, or tracks in a road. This is because maps are small when they go on the page, so contrast is important to maintain detail. Here's an example of some black lines on the water surface of one of the pools. That sort of like makes it easier to see these details in the water. When you have made the props, or if you need some variation in your work, you can make the grime and shadow layers. The grime layer is where you go around and paint more dirt on the floor, or bloodstains if you need it. Depending on the dungeon, it's often a good idea to add a bit of grime along all the walls, unless the place is supposed to be this pristine, well-kept, clean place. Or maybe you can have these very clean corridors to suggest that there might be a gelatinous cube patrolling these corridors. The shadow layer is kind of the same, only here we draw soft darkness in corners and among clusters of props. I recommend using a slightly bluish dark color instead of completely black, since it gives a more natural look. If there are light sources in your dungeon, you can also add a light layer, or you paint in the orange glow in front of fireplaces, the green light spilling off a curtain of green flames, and so on. These 3 layers, grime, shadow and light, really helps to make the map pop. How you do all these drawing steps is a matter of practice and preference. I used more than a dozen different brushes for various parts of the process, like this engraving brush for making palm leaves, or this texture brush for making cracks in the rocks. Brushes can do a lot of the work for you, so don't be heroic and just use this simple round brush for all your work, because you don't need to. Brushes can do a lot of it for you. And here is the map that I ended up with. I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out, and it only took about 10 hours to make. Now let's look at the last step in the process of a dungeon intended for an audience. Playtesting. To playtest your dungeon, you need 2 things. Players, and an idea of what you want from the test. How you get your players depends on your circumstances. If you already have a game group, that's a good place to start, but you can also look for playtesters in other places like Reddit or Discord, if you're brave. Ideally, you want players that have some experience with the game system that you're using, because you want them to be able to give informed feedback afterwards. And while the players should try to engage with the dungeon as naturally as possible, you can ask them to be a bit more mindful about their experience than normal, because you're going to be asking them questions afterwards. With regard to what to look out for in the test, here are some suggestions. Places where the players get stuck or confused about how to progress. An example from my own game was a corridor blocked by a window that the players didn't realize that they couldn't break or open because they thought it was an illusion. In addition to the description highlighting the presence of a window handle on the inside indicates more strongly that opening the windows is an option. Next, you want to look for things that catches the player's interest, which might need some more information. For example, in a haunted house dungeon, the players got really interested in the history of the ghosts, so a section of the backstory of these ghosts would be an appropriate addition. If you have puzzles in your dungeon, now is the time to see if they are as difficult or as easy as you had intended. Maybe some superfluous description becomes an unintended red herring and needs to be cut, or a crucial aspect of the puzzle goes unnoticed by the players and needs to be more highlighted. If you have secret doors that hide something important, gauge how likely the players are to find it. It's okay if a group doesn't find one of the secret doors, but if none of the secrets are found in the dungeon, or the players are unable to find them even if they're trying to, maybe spread some clues about the presence of these secrets. Scratch marks on the floor could indicate a secret door and stuff like that. The last thing to look out for is not within the player's experience, it is the DM's experience. When running the dungeon with the players, how do you find the organization of the information? Look out for unclear lines of information or areas with too much text. Can some information be moved to a more convenient place to make it easier for the DM's flow? Do you have trouble finding bits of information in the text that you wrote yourself? Do you find yourself without enough information in some places? Look out for this and see where you can make improvements. These are all things that you can look out for during the play. But afterwards, you need to do some Q&A. There are all kinds of questions that you can ask your players, but here are some of those I think might be the most important ones. Questions like, which parts did the players like and why? Which part didn't they like and why? Was something missing or confusing? Was the atmosphere in the dungeon evocative? Did the players feel like their class had some moments to shine in this dungeon? You can ask all other kinds of questions, but again, it kind of depends on what you're looking for yourself and so on. You basically want to dig into the experience that the players had and see if there are places where it can be improved. And with that, we have a dungeon. Super easy. I'll put a link in the description to DM's Guild where you can pick up the finished sample dungeon if you're curious about how it turned out in the end. If you watched this and the last video on dungeon design, first of all, thank you for sticking around, but also you might be looking at this structure of organizing ideas and making layouts and finding a story and so on, and ask yourself, where is the magic? Where is the free creativity when everything is put into steps and methods? The answer is, the magic is everywhere. Once you begin the process, one step will inspire the next. When you're creating the monsters or the treasures, you'll get ideas that inspire other parts of the dungeon. Maybe something can be used in a puzzle that you didn't think about, or maybe the descriptions of one area inspires the function of another. It all begins to turn into this magical creative soup. All this structure is basically only there to enable your creativity, to give it a road to drive on or whatever the saying is. So I hope you will have fun with this, and I'll probably make some more in-depth videos on other aspects of the dungeon, like drawing the dungeon and monster design and so on. So if you want to catch those videos, you can subscribe. If you want to support me in this channel, the easiest way to do that is just liking the video and writing a comment. If you have any suggestions for future videos, you can also write them in the comments and I'll add them to the list. You can also go to my DM's Guild page and buy some of this shit in there. The link is in the description. But until next time, treat yourself well, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!